Hello, everybody. My name's Claire Acevedo, and our colleague Mike Hart has asked me to talk to you today about Reading to Learn. So I'm going to share my screen with you and talk to you about the work I've been doing, about the program Reading to Learn, and also about the work I've been doing with Reading to Learn over many years with our colleague, Dr. David Rose. So I'm from Australia, and but I've been living in the United Kingdom now for some 14 years, and I work mainly in Europe with Reading to Learn, but I've worked around the world with Reading to Learn after working very closely with David in Australia for about 7 years. So I've been doing teacher professional development with Reading to Learn for about 20 years. I've worked with preschool teachers, primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, and tertiary educators, like many of you who are viewing this. And a lot of my work with the tertiary sector has been in South America, in Chile, Argentina, and in Colombia. So let's get started anyway with the program. So we can't really talk about Reading to Learn without talking about the developer of Reading to Learn, our colleague, Dr. David Rose at the University of Sydney in Australia, very well known to Mike. And I invite you to go to the website to look at the resources there and get to know more about Reading to Learn there. Reading to Learn is being used around the world now. Started in Australia with David, with Indigenous learners in outback locations, but then he started using it in urban situations, and I came to work with David in about the year 2000 in my hometown Melbourne down here. David was up here in Sydney, and he used to commute, and we would give programs mainly focusing on migrant students in the later years of primary and the secondary school. But then later Reading to Learn just became used as a mainstream pedagogy. And when I came to the UK, I had a big project for a couple of years across Europe. And here are the many projects in Africa. Here's the project in Barranquilla, Santiago and Buenos Aires, and other projects around the world. So if you take up Reading to Learn in your institution, you'll be part of a worldwide network of Reading to Learn users. And David and I are just in the process of editing a book, and the book will celebrate stories from 17 different Reading to Learn programs in all continents from around the world except Antarctica. We haven't been able to get the penguins interested yet. So that's where we're up to with that. Now, you might ask, why Reading to Learn? Why is it so successful? Well, we talk about it closing the gap. So from some of our projects, we're able, if there's funding available, we collect data. So this is a project from Australia in 2008, a big project, 90 schools involved, from the first year of schooling right through to the middle of secondary schooling. And we have a big difference in an average difference in all classes with our lowest achieving students and our highest achieving students at the start of the year. And we had another group in the middle, but I've taken those away for this. And then we started working with the teachers at the beginning of the year, starting to teach them about Reading to Learn. And over the course of the year, they implemented it in their classroom as many times as they could. And you can see there was a tremendous growth for the low achieving students. They actually reached, average levels for their age and stage of schooling. And of course, there was still growth with the top students. So that's all of the results that we've collected over time from different groups of students. We get very similar results to these. So why Reading to Learn then? It's been effective in what we call democratizing the classroom by closing this gap that I showed you on the graph between the high and the low achieving students in any classroom. It can be used in any language, at any stage of schooling, with learners of all ages. It can be used in all areas of the curriculum by all teachers, and it uses the usual classroom materials and develops teacher knowledge about language and pedagogy. So the teachers themselves become the tool for the transformational learning of the students. So it's a very powerful program. If you're a language teacher, it meets and goes beyond all the aims of language education programs that typically focus on vocabulary, spelling, punctuation, sentence level grammar. It focuses on reading for meaning. And at the same time, it develops knowledge about how texts work for teachers, and then teachers pass this knowledge on to their students. Then uses knowledge from reading to scaffold students to quickly write high-level texts of their own. The classroom interaction pattern for supporting reading engages all students in meaning making and not only ensures comprehension, but builds the self-esteem of struggling learners, which is one of the most important elements of the program. So the Reading to Learn program builds on the early genre writing work that was done in the primary schools in Australia in the 1980s. And then that was developed further in the 90s, looking at writing in the secondary school. So it was still all writing up until the 90s, and it was only around 2000 where David Rose and other colleagues started using it for reading, initially with Indigenous learners in the primary school, but then David took it to the next level with the secondary school and at the University of Sydney in the Koori Centre with the adult Indigenous learners. And from there, it's gone to mainstream schools. It's used by special education teachers, second language teachers, and in developed and underdeveloped rural and urban settings, and in so many languages. Myself, I've used it in with teachers teaching in 7 different languages. So very versatile, and a robust model that's very versatile and flexible. And of course, it's based on a lot of linguistic theory and research. So starting off with Michael Halliday and his functional grammar, further developed by Jim Martin, looking at genre and working with discourse as he began to work, Jim Martin began to work with David Rose. Then we're looking at genre relations, a whole range of genres. And finally in 2012, the pedagogy book, Learning to Write, Reading to Learn, which is the book I recommend for you to consult if you're going to undertake Reading to Learn. It's sort of got the history, it's got lots of practical examples, and that's probably the best place for you to start. So we've moved from grammar to discourse, register and genre, the knowledge genres, and then the curriculum genres. So here are your reference materials. So we've got the book, and also on David Rose's website, you can see the teacher professional development materials, which are the ones I use when I do my professional development in English. So that we're all working out of the same concepts, we'll just have a little pause here and think about what is a genre, because the word genre is used widely to talk about a whole range of things, but we're sort of talking about what I call Sydney school genre pedagogy. And when we're using the word genre in these terms, we're thinking about the fact that all texts have a purpose, and all texts, whether they're written, spoken or visual, that have the same purpose, have common or global patterns of organization, then they have similar phases and similar linguistic patterns. So the idea is that teachers who can identify genres can then work with the patterns in texts using a scaffolding cycle to enhance student literacy and learning. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So the theoretical foundations here of Reading to Learn are, of course, the educational linguistics initiated by Halliday and further developed in terms of genre and register by Martin. Social learning theory of Lev Vygotsky, as it was further developed by Woods and Bruner in terms of the notion of scaffolding. And the unique element for Reading to Learn, which opened up the writing pedagogy to reading, really is the work on the pedagogic discourse pattern that David Rose has been used, inspired by the work of the sociologist Basil Bernstein. So let's look at each of these three theoretical underpinnings just briefly before we move on to look at the pedagogy itself. So when we're looking at Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. So this is a common diagram that's used to talk about the theoretical framework. So in this part here, what we've got is any student's zone of actual development, what the student can do on their own, unaided. And of course, over time, we expect some gains over time. But what we do with Reading to Learn is we work in the next zone, which is, as Vygotsky names it, the zone of proximal development, using this notion of scaffolding that Bruner developed. So here we're looking at working at what is just out of reach of the students. So what the students can't do without assistance. So we assist them to work at this next level of development. And instead of just getting an incremental development here, we get a big developmental gain from wherever the students are to this next level, and the teacher is the instrument of the scaffolding. I'll talk a bit more about that. So when I work with teachers, this is the model I use to explain to them how we implement the scaffolding for reading and writing. So we first of all lead and model, the teacher leads and models. Then we have some joint practice, which is actually the scaffolding. So whether we practice jointly with the students, either with reading or writing, to put into practice what we've modeled. So we model it. It's not telling them what to do, but showing them, modeling it. We do it together, and then we give the students their normal assignments or tests or classwork to see if they can put into practice the skills we've given them. So before we ask them to do their assignments and things, we model the skills that they need to be able to do it in a parallel sort of topic. We practice together with them, and then we ask them to do their own, and that would be their assessment task. So we have teacher-led and modeled. Then we have the joint practice. Now, for writing, you probably know we can all write together on the board. We can take student ideas and we can scribe for them, or get the students to scribe as we discuss things together, because it's productive. But reading is a more passive skill. We're taking it in. So we have to make the process of reading visible. So we have to, so that we can look at this practice and then do it together. So we're taking what is an invisible pedagogy and we're making it visible, or I should say the typical invisible pedagogy, and we're making it visible. And then working in the zone of proximal development, and then we give the students their normal independent learning tasks, and these can be assessed. But we've given them really good basis to succeed with these learning tasks. And as you can see from the data we collected, students do very well once they've started with Reading to Learn. Now, this is the model we use thinking about the linguistic underpinnings. This is how we present the model of functional language to teachers that are doing Reading to Learn. So we have everything happening within a context. We have a whole text made up of paragraphs, made up of sentences, word groups, words, syllables, and letter patterns. Typically in literacy programs and language learning programs, there's a lot of work done here. And then the students are given tasks on their own to use the words in word groups, sentences, paragraphs, etc. And there are a range of programs. For example, as I said, a lot of work is done at this level. Then for young learners or second language learners, we have graded readers, school grammar and English language teaching, or teaching in any language, really, composition at the paragraph level, genre writing, critical literacy, whole language and communicative approaches. And so typically teachers give a little bit of each of these according to what they think, using different resources, maybe different textbooks, and then students need to synthesize this material and put it together to produce their own work. But of course, it's very difficult, particularly for our less experienced readers and writers, our lower achieving students, to synthesize all of this information and produce work under this system. So in Reading to Learn, we look at the functional model of language and we start at the top. So we look at the context, what the context is, and then we choose a text to realize this context. And then we look at the patterns within the text, which is what we call the genre. Then, of course, the patterns within the sentence. If we need to work more closely with the sentence, it depends on the student's capabilities. And then if we're working with language learners or special education students, we can actually, or young learners, we can actually look at the patterns within the word in spelling in the primary school and that sort of thing. But we start at the top and we only need to go as far down in the model as our students need. So if they don't need a lot of work at the word level, we don't have to work specifically there. So what we've got is this top-down approach. And there are lots of approaches they call top-down approach, but they're not based on linguistics. So they're not systematically looking at each of these layers of language and working with them. They might be doing it more as a whole language approach. And so they just look at reading as one thing, rather than looking at reading as being quite specific to the genre or the purpose of the text, as I explained earlier. So our foundation professor of systemic functional linguistics, Professor Michael Halliday, lets us know that failure in schooling is a failure to learn language. So in order for students to be successful, they need to learn language, learn through language, and learn about language. And of course, in my work as a teacher educator, I need to work with the teachers so that the teachers are need probably a little bit more knowledge about language than they might have had in their initial teacher preparation, so that they can pass on all the knowledge to their students. So that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about now. So our idea here is quite often people, language educators, teach the system, and then the students are asked to use their knowledge of the system to produce their text, to read and write their own texts. But we sort of work in the other way. So we think of each text as an example of a particular genre, and we work through the text in this top-down fashion. And each time we work with the text, students are learning about the system. So we look at each text as an instance of the system. So whether we're looking at factual texts or literary texts, each text is an example of hundreds of thousands of genres, instances of text in the same genre. Then if we look at Reading to Learn, particularly how we're going to scaffold the reading, this is the hallmark, the most important aspect, I think, of the Reading to Learn program, is that it draws on Basil Bernstein's work on the unequal distribution of knowledge by the teacher in the classroom. And our colleague David Rose redesigned the default classroom pattern, interaction pattern, which is to initiate with a question, a student responds, and we give the feedback yes or no, and then we might build on that answer that's given by that, usually those same 4 or 5 students that answer all the time. So in the Reading to Learn discourse pattern, we begin with a preparation move that would include all students in the interactions around reading. So we give a preparation. So who can see a word that tells us something in particular? And the student's task is to identify. So they identify the word, and then or the wording, and then we elaborate on that. And that's actually our teaching move. And all the students can be engaged because we've given the preparation move. They could all identify the words we are asking them to look for, and then we give the elaboration. And I'll be demonstrating this briefly for you a little bit later in the presentation. So detailed reading is planned, it's highly planned. It's teacher-guided interaction around the features of the text and the language used. So the interaction is oriented to the text, locating information in the sentences. The next sentence tells us, at the start it tells us, highlighting the information in the text. Let's highlight that. Making predictions based on the information. All the rest of him is probably outside. Finding synonyms, learning the meaning of words, drawing inferences. Out in the open means there's nowhere to hide. Establishing logical relations between information. That's why he's creeping so slowly. So in any text, this is what we're doing. So it's the interactions oriented towards the text. So we have an interaction pattern. So that cycle that I showed you earlier. More specifically, if we're looking at it from the point of view of linguistics, we have the preparation move, a focus. The students identify, we affirm, and then we elaborate. So the preparation is so that students can identify meanings. The focus is to identify the wording, to decode the meanings. We direct them to highlight words to make this process of reading visible. And then we elaborate, expanding the meanings, explaining logical relations, relating to personal experience, etc. Whatever you like, some question and answer or discussion with the students. So if teachers follow the reading to learn pedagogy and use this discourse pattern, they are in fact, without even being conscious of it, implementing key principles from systemic functional linguistics, scaffolding based on Vygotsky's notion of the zone of proximal development, and implementing ideas from Bernstein's notion of pedagogic discourse. And what we do is we include all the students in the classroom. So usually we ask a question and we get 4 or 5 hands go up to answer the question, because these are our tops. Usually they're the highest achieving students and they're always very involved and they know the answers to our questions. Then there are some students who are listening and they partake and they're engaged in this, but there's a large group of students who are not engaged in these constant interactions with, you know, a small number of students in the class that teachers will typically talk about discussion. I teach through discussion, but it's not often these students are really discussed. If the teacher points them out and asks a specific question, they may or may not answer. But what the teachers refer to as the discussion is using the answers of the top students and sometimes these students to really make their points and move the lesson forward. But in Reading to Learn, we give a preparation so that students can direct their attention to a text, and all students in the class can identify elements in the text and they become actively engaged throughout the lesson. So we have a pedagogy cycle for Reading to Learn, and the first step is to select a text that you want to use to achieve your curriculum purposes from your normal curriculum, whatever stage you're at. And then we have an outer circle. So this is the least supportive type of learning, and this is sometimes what we do in the university, because people that come to university already have at least some skills in reading and writing. Whereas perhaps in the primary or the secondary school, we may have a lot of lower achieving students. So we always begin with preparing before reading. And to do that, this is an activity we do in the classroom. But to be prepared for the reading, we have to prepare in the staff room ourselves. And then we read the text together and take some notes. And then we do a joint construction with the students, and this has prepared them then to do their own independent work, and they're much more likely to have success. However, when we've got a very high level text right at the top end of that zone of proximal development, we prepare for reading a whole text. We read the text together, and then we will choose a paragraph or two to read sentence by sentence in detail. Then we might rewrite this paragraph again in our own words, and maybe even ask the students to do that again from their notes to see if they can do it on their own. And then we might come out the other side, we might do a joint construction, and then the students do their independent writing. There's also an inner circle here, where we can work with just 1 or 2 sentences for young learners, second language learners, or in special education settings, but we're not going to talk about that today because I'm focusing mainly on secondary school teachers and tertiary educators. So we go in one side with the reading, we come around the cycle, and we come out again with the writing. So it's using the knowledge from reading to write highly literate texts. And in a linear fashion, we can see from reading to writing, preparing for reading, and then we choose either paragraph by paragraph reading on the outer circle or detailed reading on that inner circle, just of a sentence by sentence, a paragraph or 2. Then we can jointly rewrite that paragraph, or if we're doing the paragraph by paragraph reading, we might move on to joint construction. Or we can do all of these if we're really working intensively with the students, perhaps in the secondary school. So we're moving always from reading to writing. And then, of course, there are the language focus there. If you're the language teacher, then we're looking at patterns in the field unfolding through the genre, patterns of meaning in the paragraph, meaning within and between sentences, grammatical structures, and stages and phases of the genres. So teachers who are also language teachers focus automatically on this, but teachers who are maybe social science teachers or science teachers, you are doing this while you're focusing on reading to learn, but you might not have such a specific focus in your discipline area. So teachers are usually concerned with what a text is about, but reading to learn also is going to focus not just on the topic or the content. Reading to learn also focuses on what the text is doing, what the purpose of the text is. So reading to learn asks the question, is it describing? Is it explaining? Is it presenting a point of view or entertaining, etc.? So reading to learn combines the typical concern of the teacher, what's the text about, what's the topic, and then goes further and asks what is the text doing, and the pedagogy combines these two elements into one whole. So we work with the mode continuum, and we look at how highly spoken a written text might be. So a particular phenomenon in primary and secondary schools is because teachers are saying students can't read very well, the educational publishers start writing the text down to the level of the students. So a lot of the texts are very like spoken language written down, and this is really not going to push the students. What we want to do is take the spoken language. So in the first years of schooling, the little ones are writing down spoken language, and then we start orienting them towards the patterns of written language until they're ready at the end of secondary schooling to go on perhaps to tertiary education and highly written language. So for example, I've got a few little snippets here from different subject areas. So we might have, when we're speaking to children, we talk about washing your hands, particularly with the recent pandemic, about washing your hands. So here we're looking at the activity and we're using verbs. Then this might become in a leaflet for coronavirus. They might talk about hand washing. So you talk about frequent hand washing. Then when you go into perhaps a hospitality setting, they'll talk about hand hygiene. So now it becomes a technical term, until we, in the academic sense, it becomes infection control in a hospital setting, for example, a medical setting. And this is what we would call a grammatical metaphor for hand washing. So we've got in the active form, we've got a nominalization, a technical term, and then our academic language or our grammatical metaphor. So now I'm just quickly going to show you what we call the map of the genres of schooling. So we base the work on Reading to Learn on the work that the linguists have done, analysing many hundreds of texts and looking at the purpose of the text. And they found that in the context of schooling, there are three key social purposes, or three key groupings of social purposes for text. So texts that have the purpose of engaging, texts that inform, that's the biggest group, and evaluating texts. So our engaging texts are all our different types of stories, and the linguists do a little network here for us. They're organised as a sequence of events, either with a complicating event or no complication. Complicating event that's resolved is our narrative. Unresolved, we get what we're calling linguistically an anecdote or exemplum. Then for the informing texts, we've got texts that are staged in time that we're going to call chronicles, explanations about cause and effect, reports where time stands still that are describing different things, and then procedures that are directing. So your science experiments and recipes, protocols, and then a recount of a procedure, those prac reports they write in science. Then we get our evaluating text, so arguments, persuasive text, text responses, and then in the university level, most assignments that students are given will have at least some evaluative elements in there, and this group expands a little bit. These two groups expand a little bit for the university. So then in the Reading to Learn materials that I use, that David Rose has produced, we have the same information, but now spread out on a table with some additional features. So we have the name of the genre. So we've got the families, stories, chronicles, explanations, reports, procedures, and then our evaluative texts there. We've got the purpose, and then how they unfold in stages. So you'll notice that a recount has an orientation and some events, but our narrative has an orientation, a complication, and a resolution. And that's the only story genre with a resolution. And then if we look, there are different phases in stories. All or any of these phases are present in any of these stories. So these are the smaller steps. And these are the literary tools that the authors have to engage us in different ways in the stories. And then we have chronicles, 2 stages in those, explanations, two stages, and then the phases in these information texts vary depending on the content, what they're about. So if you get a report about a city, it's going to have, you know, population, culture, economy, that sort of thing, whereas a report about a kangaroo will have appearance, habitat, breeding, feeding, etc. So there's going to be different phases, but they're quite predictable. So we'll have a bit of a closer look at this group. So we're going to look at the informing text today because I'm thinking about secondary and tertiary educators here. So I've just made that a little bit bigger for you to see. So there's our chronicles, our explanations, our reports, and our procedures. So each time a teacher gets a text, we ask them to think about what is this text doing, not just what it's about, what is it doing? And teachers are very familiar with their subject area. And so if they're teaching history, they're probably going to have something like this and an explanation, maybe a report. They're probably not going to have a procedure in the history texts so much, but the science teachers will for their prac work in the laboratory. So you can, after a while, predict the subject area and what sort of texts we're going to have. So this is our Reading to Learn pedagogy cycle that I explained before. So we always begin with preparing before reading. So this is something we do in the classroom. This is a strategy to implement in the classroom. But in order to do that, the teacher has to prepare in the staff room for the preparing for reading in the classroom, to enact that in the classroom. And once they've done that, they've done, 50 or 60% of the work for preparing the whole cycle. So the teachers need to read their text carefully and work out what genre the text is. So for example, I've got one here. The cost to society of the fast fashion industry. I've already analysed this, that it's a consequential explanation. And I did that by looking here at reading the text and looking at what it was doing. And I could see that the text was telling me that fast fashion has a massive hidden cost, all right? And then it tells us that it creates greenhouse gas emissions, uses water, it's based on chemical fibers, toxic textile dyes, waste, and exploit people in developing countries. So I was able to say, this is the consequences of fast fashion. It fits in here. There's multiple effects from one cause. So the first stage is the phenomenon, and then the rest of the text is the explanation, and we've got consequence 1, 2, 3. I actually called it effect, but that's all right. So if we look here, so I've got explanation, effect 1, effect 2, effect 3. So that's what we do to prepare our text in the staff room before we go into the classroom. That's our step 1. And we've identified it as a consequential explanation, and we make our notes. Now, to prepare for reading to learn, teachers need to make links between what the text is about, the topic or content, and the genre information, what the text is doing, its purpose, and how it unfolds through the genre. So we have the preparing before reading. So the teacher would enact this in the classroom orally, and in the first stage, they might use some visual material. So step 1 doesn't really involve reading to learn so much. It's not so new. This is what a good teacher would do anyway. They would always begin before reading with some background knowledge that's needed to access the text. In reading to learn, we don't tell the students everything that happens in the text because this will emerge during the reading. So you'd be familiar with this. So teachers usually engage students with pictures or diagrams, a short video clip. They pose some questions to see what the students might already know about the topic. Some key terms may be discussed and written on the board. But importantly, you do not need to teach all the key vocabulary at this stage. Sometimes teachers decide on what will be unknown or difficult words for the students, and they try and teach them all of those first, and then they think they'll remember them all and it'll make the reading easier. But we don't do that in reading to learn. We might have a couple of things written on the board. And so the advice is, don't spend too long on this first step, just a few minutes. Students only need just enough information to become engaged in the text and the topic. The meanings will emerge as the text's read aloud, then read again and highlighted. And then the key information is written as notes on the board, and they copy the notes down. So this is a kind of photograph we might use during this stage 1. Very familiar strategy. This is dumped used clothes in the Atacama Desert in the north of Chile. So that, gets the discussion going. Now, this is the new part where we're going to use the knowledge about the genre, the purpose of the text, the stages and the phases. So we're going to use this knowledge to walk the students through the text using everyday language to preview the sequence in which it unfolds. Now, the teacher does this orally, but I've written it down for you. I've timed it. It takes me 1 minute and 25 seconds. So it's the preparation takes much longer than the actual strategy in the classroom, but I want you to see it. And I've highlighted the genre terminology that I'm going to use. So I say to the students, this text explains 6 negative consequences of buying fast fashion. The first paragraph defines this phenomenon of rapid production and purchasing of clothes. The second paragraph explains how customers are influenced to constantly buy the latest fashion, but that this practice has some hidden negative consequences. The rest of the text then gives a paragraph by paragraph explanation of 6 negative consequences or effects of fast fashion on the environment and for developing countries. The first 3 effects of the manufacturing and distribution of fast fashion are the production of greenhouse gases, the use of large amounts of water, and petroleum-based synthetic materials that don't break down and thus pollute our oceans. A 4th effect is water pollution caused by the use of toxic colored dyes. The 5th effect is the huge amount of waste that's created by all these clothes being thrown away. That's what you saw in the photograph of the Atacama Desert. And the final negative effect mentioned is how businesses in developed countries produce these clothes in developing countries to save money by exploiting poorly paid workers. Now, let's read the text together. So that's the 2 parts of preparing before reading. It only takes a number of minutes before the lesson to engage and orient the students to the content. And here you'll see, because it's a consequential explanation, I'm now introducing them to the meta language already, saying it explains the consequences. It defines this phenomenon, this happening. The second paragraph explains there are negative consequences. And so we're talking about the first 3 effects, the 4th, the 5th, and the final one. So we're developing a meta language that we then we introduce it at this stage and then keep using it with the students for each genre that we encounter. In Reading to Learn, we have different activity sequences for factual and literary texts. So for factual texts, we highlight the key information as we do either detailed reading or paragraph by paragraph reading. The highlighted information, we then make notes, joint class notes, and then we close the reading text. And then we work with the notes to write new sentences. So this is how we get it into what the teachers often talk about, into your own words. So it's the same content, more or less, but it's now in new wordings or new sentences. Stories, text responses and arguments is like the other side of the coin. So we highlight the literary patterns or the argument patterns, and then we put in new content, a new argument, new characters, plot and setting for a story. And then we write it in the new content, borrowing some of the argument and literary patterns here. So this is the sequence we're looking at today for my very brief demonstration. So following the step-by-step summary of how the field unfolds through the genre that's provided in preparing for reading, the students then listen and follow in their own copies of the text as the text's read aloud, 1 paragraph at a time. The teacher prepares them for the paragraph by telling them what to expect in this paragraph, using those same notes that we wrote down the side in terms of the stage and the phase of the genre. So at the beginning, we would say, so first of all, the author identifies the phenomenon and defines for us what fast fashion is. After the paragraph's read, the teacher elaborates the meaning, discussing key points and guiding the students to highlight information, the key information. The highlighted wordings will later be written on the board as class notes. So it's going to look like this. But of course, the teacher needs to do this in the staff room first, so that when we're in the classroom, we know what words we're going to guide the students to highlight. So how do they guide the students to highlight? So we're going to use the prepare, task, elaborate, discourse pattern, and the students are going to be highlighting. So the teacher prepares and guides the students to highlight key wordings with general meaning cues. The students follow the teacher cues to orally identify the key wordings and then underline them. The teacher then elaborates the meanings as necessary, and this may include discussion with the students or question and answer. So all the wordings within sentences express a small set of general meanings. So they talk about people, things, processes, places, time, and qualities. So we're going to use these question words not to ask questions, but to identify who can see the words that tell us who this is about, who can see the expression that tells us what's happening, what they're doing, who can see the words about where, when, how. So these are the basic set of general meanings. We call them our work cues to the teachers, and the teachers get very good at using these cues very quickly. So I'll just show you, this is not a magnificent sentence, but it would go a little bit like this. So I would say this is the beginning, the first sentence in our text, and the author here defines for us what fast fashion is, identifies the phenomenon and defines it. So I would read the sentence: the fast in fast fashion refers to how quickly trends go from the catwalk to the wardrobe. And then I'd say, who can tell me the two words in this first sentence near the beginning that tell us what the text is about? It's about fast fashion, says a student. Exactly right. Let's highlight fast fashion. Who can see how fast the fashion moves? So it moves quickly. That's exactly right. And straight after that, there's another word for fashion, a synonym for fashion. After quickly, it's trends. So fashion or trends. Then it tells us where the trends move from. They move from the catwalk. Exactly. Let's underline catwalk. And where they go to the wardrobe. Exactly right. So the catwalk, does anyone know what that is? That's where the models walk in a fashion parade. So they call it that. It's a narrow path that a cat might walk down with special slinky steps. So it's a little bit about the cat and it's a little bit about the narrow path. And then I would elaborate. I'm not sure what the elaboration would be for this. I just made this up. So the first sentence introduces the topic of the text and gives us a definition. Why do you think they chose fast fashion and not quick fashion? And we might talk about alliteration there, fast fashion instead of quick fashion, but you might think of something better there. So prior to the lesson, the teacher needs to make sure that these words they've underlined are going to give them a good set of notes. So the teacher would just write these out and make sure, you know, that what they've highlighted. Sometimes I highlight things and then when I'm writing the notes, I think, no, I've got too much and I take some away, or I think, oh, I need an extra word here. So you've sort of got to make sure you've got enough. It's not the end of the world if you have to adjust it in the class, but for the low achieving students, you know, the less sort of mucking around in the class, the better. So then we're going to prepare for writing an information text. We need to take the notes. So we've got the teacher's role and the student's role. So the teacher's role is to direct and guide the note-making activity. So the students start taking more control here. So the students take turns at dictating and scribing the highlighted words as class notes on the board, or if you've got, you know, a lot of technology, you can do it via the computer and project it up. So the teacher supports the scribe and the dictator and also continues to elaborate and discuss the meanings from the text with the class. And student 1 dictates from the desk usually to student 2, who is the scribe. The whole class listens, participates in the discussion and copies the notes while waiting to dictate and scribe. So this is a supported cooperative activity where the students begin to take charge of the text. The scribe doesn't need to know the wordings or the spelling, as another student dictates the highlighted wordings directly from the text and provides spelling if necessary, because that student's got the text in front of them. The teacher organises the notes into the genre stages. And can that move away, please? and stages and phases, and may also make comments to prepare for the writing. So the teacher can talk about how we're going to write it, so that it would be written up on the board like this. So that's what the full set of notes would look like. The students can use iPads if they've got them, old-fashioned notes. You know, you can do it high-tech or low-tech, this strategy. Now we're going to move on to joint construction. In joint construction, the teacher explicitly guides students to practice writing using the structures of the genre of the model text, the stages and phases, or the steps within each stage. This gives students a high level of support to understand the language choices the author used, so they can make similar choices themselves in their own independent writing. As each stage and phase is identified, the teacher writes the name of it on the class text so that a shared class meta-language is built up. Using the class notes, the teacher guides the class to recast them into new sentences, constantly referring to the notes and the text structure. In preparation, the teacher should write a possible text before the lesson to ensure their awareness of what needs to be focused on and what problems might arise. So if you're in a university setting or upper secondary and you've got students who are, this text is not so far beyond what they could do on their own, you can get them to write, or the teacher can write. It doesn't matter. So here's some possible joint constructions, and you can write one paragraph and then get the students to do their own from the notes, and then you can get them to come and write it up or read out the different paragraphs that they got. So you can do, there's lots of things you can do here to cater for different levels of achievement in the class, or you do 1 or 2 paragraphs together and the rest is for homework if you've got your senior students. So that's where I'm going to leave it today. I've tried to talk to you a little bit about Reading to Learn, give you a little run through of the strategies. And I'd just like to say thank you very much. Bye.